Major breaking news. The Trump administration for the 2026 fiscal year budget has just announced its intention and desire to merge the ATF and the DEA together to fight gun and drug crimes. Let's break down what this means when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, so this is huge breaking news. The Trump administration has just released its fiscal year budget proposal for 2026. And in that proposal, it talks about its desire to merge, keyword to merge, that's the verb, to merge the ATF with the DEA. Now, in their fiscal year budget proposal, the Trump administration talks about the importance of international crime fighting by the DEA, and that makes some sense. But at the end of this discussion, they say they want to merge the ATF into the DEA for the purposes of crime fighting. But the problem is, of course, are they really just conflating two problems together? But before we get into the details and the analysis, let me just read to you what they have to say about the DEA's mission and how they expect the ATF to play a role in it moving forward. Here's what the Trump administration writes in their proposal. The DEA works with its foreign counterparts to attack the vulnerabilities in the leadership, production, transportation, communications, finance, and distribution sectors of major international drug trafficking organizations. The DEA's objectives for international enforcement include identifying and targeting the most significant international drug and chemical trafficking organizations, disrupting and dismantling the networks, financial infrastructures, operations, and resource bases of targeted international drug and chemical trafficking organizations, and preventing drug trafficking organizations from funding terrorist organizations and activities. Beginning in fiscal year 2026, the DEA will focus its foreign operations and resources in the countries identified as major drug transit or major illicit drug producing countries, consistent with the presidential determinations. Now, here's the key, folks. Listen carefully to this. To most successfully, effectively, and efficiently continue the fight to eradicate the designated cartel FTOs and seek to eliminate violent crime, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, will be incorporated into the DEA, addressing both drug and gun crimes. All right, so this is quite interesting. Now, I'm not going to take a final position on the good and the bad and the ugly of this. I think it's premature because I want to hear some explanations from the administration. I want to hear what other people think about this. This is a complicated topic, a lot of moving parts, but I will give you some observations. You've heard some of these observations before many months ago at the start of the Trump administration. I'll repeat some of these and then I will expand on them. To begin with, to the extent there are historic dangers to civil liberties and civil rights from the ATF and or from the DEA, merging two entities that are flawed together only compounds the error. It compounds the flaws. Think of it this way. I don't want to use this metaphor, but it's kind of the best metaphor. Let's assume that both the ATF and the DEA have contagious diseases. If you merge them together, you don't resolve and solve for those contagious, terrible diseases. You simply make them worse because the diseases that the DEA has now infects the ATF. The diseases the ATF has now infects the DEA. And you compound the problem. You compound the issues associated with this by virtue of simply merging two flawed organizations. And to the extent those flaws are dangers and risks to our fundamental constitutional rights, not just the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms with the ATF, but also with potential problems under the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the other amendments, Eighth Amendment, whatever, the criminal justice amendments, including, for example, warrantless searches, unreasonable searches and seizures, dynamic entries, no-knock raids, and so on. To the extent you have these kinds of problems and possibly the concerns about the militarization of the domestic police forces in the United States, you basically have made the situation worse by merging these two entities together. Now, with that said, there is a possible way to kind of fix some of this stuff up, and I've talked about this kind of generally before. To me, when you're dealing with the ATF, the first thing to understand about reforming the ATF is that it really And I'm just talking about the gun stuff. I'm not going to talk about the tobacco. I'm not going to talk about the alcohol, which are really just taxation things. A lot of this deals with like people running around with, cigarettes where they haven't paid the tax, alcohol games. I'm not sure that's kind of a taxation issue with the alcohol and the tobacco. I don't think that's where the issue is. And then the explosives references, frankly, that's just a series of buildings and some expertise. You can stick people that are, bomb detonators and or bomb disablers and or explosive professionals. You can stick those in any law enforcement agency. You just cut and paste them and move them over there. None of the stuff affects the most dangerous part of the ATF, which deals with firearms, which is kind of the heart of the organization. Now, the way to understand the ATF as it relates to specifically firearms is that it has two components to it, right? It has the criminal side, it has the law enforcement side, like their police, like their cops, and then it has the other side, which is the civil regulatory side. And I've said for many years now that the way to reform the ATF and to fix some of the nonsense that they go through is you have to separate the ATF into two parts, and you've got to get rid of that part that deals with the criminal justice, that deals with crime fighting, that deals with anything associated with the traditional role of policing, of law enforcement, of cops and robbers. You've got to take that away from the ATF entirely. You can't have any part of the ATF involved with the criminal justice system beyond if they see a crime or they suspect a crime, they pick up the phone like any other American and they can call the FBI, they can call the cops, they can call the U.S. Attorney's Office and say, hey, I'm worried about what I just saw. Any American could call the cops, right? If I see a problem on the street, I can call the police and say, hey, I think there's a crime being committed. I think there's a robbery here. Maybe you should show up. That's fine. The ATF, if they see a crime, they should be able to pick up the phone and call the cops, call the U.S. Attorney's Office, call the FBI, whatever. But the ATF in and of itself should have zero, nada law enforcement authority. They should not be able to arrest you. They should not be able to put you in prison. They should not be able to do anything associated with traditional law enforcement efforts. That part of the ATF should go away. Now, whether or not you take those agents and you put them on the southern border to protect our border, or you fire them, send them off to early retirement, that's a separate question. But whatever it is, the ATF itself simply must be denied the ability to engage in any form of law enforcement on its own initiative. The problem is that because the ATF among federal law enforcement agents is looked down upon, and everyone knows this, including the ATF agents, right, who are basically agents that wanted to get a job with the Secret Service or with the FBI and couldn't get those jobs, and then they get sent to ATF. They know that, I know that, we know that, everyone knows this, okay? That is kind of the long-standing understanding that ATF agents view themselves, and everyone views them as the little brother to the FBI. Maybe right, maybe wrong, but I believe that's the perception. I think if you talk to enough people, you'll get that's the idea. The reason why that's a dangerous dynamic, that the FBI and the ATF already are looking at a lot of the same crimes, is that the ATF often feels the need to go above and beyond what they should be doing and get out over their skis and cause big headaches for themselves and for American citizens because they try to show that they are as cool and as competent and as important as the FBI. And when they do that, in my view, they screw stuff up royally. They get involved with the Waco dynamic entry and they get all shot up down there with that debacle. Then the same thing occurs at Ruby Ridge. Then the situation now maybe at the Arkansas airport. The point is, the ATF must be denied all law enforcement powers moving forward. That is step one. Now, with that said, I don't know if you need to abolish the ATF in and of itself, provided that the only thing the ATF does moving forward is purely regulatory matters. They become like the DMV, meaning someone in America has to process the licenses, the applications to become an FFL, a federal firearms licensee. Someone has to process those. Someone has to kind of classify, is this a short barrel rifle? Is this not a rifle? They have to do these classifications. They have to answer questions from the industry. There has to be basic compliance issues with the Gun Control Act, the National Firearms Act. I may not like those laws, but they're on the books. And when they're on the books, someone has to civilly check those things out, answer questions from the industry, and so on, right? Someone's got to do that, and it could be the ATF, and it would be okay if it's the ATF, provided that the ATF has no criminal justice, no law enforcement authority. They are like the DMV. You go to the DMV to get your driver's license. You go to the DMV to get your eyes checked to see if you can have a driver's license. You go to the DMV to possibly swap out your license plate, get a title for the car. Those are civil regulatory matters, and if the DMV thinks that you're doing a crime, they can pick up the phone and call up the cops and say, hey, I think Mark's committing fraud or something. That's fine. And if the ATF in their civil regulatory processes that they go through come across a possible crime, they have every right to pick up the phone and call the cops too. They can call the FBI, they can call the U.S. Attorney's Office, they can call the cops, whatever, it doesn't matter. But they should have no special privileges and no special authority to be able to send in their own police with their own guns, with their own weapons, and do all the nonsense they do, where they block all the cameras, they turn off the body cameras, and they sneak in and they do stupid crap and get people killed and civil liberties violated. That stuff needs to end. That's the most important thing that can happen. As to what happens with the ATF civil regulatory side, that can remain, that is a separate issue. Now, the other related thing is the ATF, I'm giving you stuff that is easier to do to fix the ATF than to merge them with the DEA, which simply probably compounds the problem and blends the communicable diseases that both the DEA and the ATF have, making the whole problem worse and on steroids. The other way to solve this, of course, is to take the ATF completely out of the Department of Justice. Once you make them a purely civil regulatory agency, you then move them away from the Department of Justice and you put them where they belong, in the Department of Treasury, which is where they came from. The ATF was part of the Department of Treasury. Why? Because the ATF, a big part of what they do is deal with the National Firearms Act and NFA items where there's a stamp tax. Well, who in America basically collects the taxes for the federal government? That's the United States Department of Treasury. So why is the ATF, which is a tax collector, in the Department of Justice? Move their butts after you've made them a purely regulatory agency like the DMV, like the FDA, like the EPA, like the Census Bureau. You move their butts and drop them in the Department of Treasury. As an alternative, you could possibly drop them in the Department of Commerce on the grounds that a big part of the ATF should be done if you do what I'm saying, which is to make them a regulatory body, purely for industry, let's say, and industrial reasons. You possibly could even drop them into the Department of Commerce, right? Because they engage in commerce. It's supposed to help the gun industry and the gun manufacturers and the gun companies. That's commerce. We like commerce. That's in theory why the Department of Commerce exists. That, and you have to do the census every 10 years. But the point is, it seems to me that we're not going to be, keep this one thing, I want to keep one thing in mind. Big picture is the federal laws of the National Firearms Act and the Gun Control Act of 1968 right now are going to be on the books. Now, hopefully we can shrink some of this. We can pull suppressors out of the NFA. Hopefully we can pull short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns out of the NFA. We can shrink the NFA. We can shrink the Gun Control Act. We can, do things like that. We can also do it effectively through Second Amendment litigation. Hopefully we narrow the scope of the NFA and the Gun Control Act. Hopefully we do that. But the reality is on the ground, we are not going to be able to right now get rid of these laws. As a consequence, these gun control laws that if you violate, you go to prison because they're crimes, are going to remain on the books, which means that any federal law enforcement agency has the authority to go get you if you violate them. But if you eliminate the ATF's law enforcement authority in that sense, that is good. Because the ATF exists solely to look after gun-related problems. And where you're going to find gun-related problems, if you're looking at the if you're the ATF, is you're going to find malum prohibitum, victimless crimes. Oh, someone has, he sold too many guns today at the gun show. He has the wrong barrel in his closet. He has a solvent trap in the corner of his home. Victimless, malum prohibitum, which means they're only crimes by virtue of the waving of a wand of a legislature. There's no moral component. There's no just component. If you're in the state of nature, you know that murder, you know that rape, you know that robbery, you know that hitting somebody over the head with a baseball bat without provocation is wrong. You just know that in your body as a human. You know it's wrong in the state of nature. Laws that memorialize those laws from the state of nature are understandable to all humans. Those are malum in se crimes, evil in and of themselves. And that's why the saying says, ignorance of the law is no excuse, because in the old days, the laws derived from things that we basically knew to be good and wrong, right or wrong. It's clear. Today, there is no justice, there is no moral sense, there is no moral understanding or intrinsic understanding that a barrel length has to be a certain length or not. And you go to prison for one length and not prison the other one. There is no moral component to that. Those are malum prohibitum crimes, and basically every single federal gun control law in America is a malum prohibitum crime. So if you create an agency that is just designed to go after crimes that are malum prohibitum victimless crimes, you get the sort of crap you see in Ruby Ridge and Waco and down at the Arkansas airport. And more and more and more. And we got to eliminate those. And the best way to eliminate those is not to merge the ATF and the DEA as they are currently constituted. You got to whack the ATF into two parts. One becomes the DMV for gun licenses, FFLs, and FA tax stamps, and the rest of those agents can either be fired or just made DEA agents or made Border Patrol, or I don't care. But whatever they is, they cannot be focused on just enforcing gun laws, because federal gun control laws almost exclusively are malum prohibitum crimes. Yes, I know there are some laws out there that if you commit a federal crime using a gun, there's extra problems with that. That's a fact. But that doesn't require a standalone agency like the ATF to enforce those laws. Any federal law enforcement officer can enforce those laws. Any U.S. Attorney's Office can enforce those laws. You simply don't need an ATF to be involved with the law enforcement of America. You don't need to be policing and playing, cops and robbers with American lives. That is not the role of the ATF. They are nothing more than the DMV for FFLs and the like, and that is exactly what should be done here. So this pure merger of the ATF and DEA without these reforms I'm talking about, I would say is probably going to just simply compound the error, compound the problem, and not solve anything. But with that said, I'm glad that the Trump administration is willing to consider fundamental major changes to the ATF, because this opens up the dialogue, I think, between the Trump administration and the Second Amendment community to try to once and for all resolve our terrible nemesis and that danger to freedom, the ATF, once and for all. Of course, that's going to require a lot of thinking, and I think we got some really smart people in the Second Amendment community and some great Second Amendment related groups out there that are very smart, that I think can help the Trump administration get to a good result that protects our right to keep and bear arms and all of our fundamental freedoms, including, for example, our Fourth and Fifth Amendment freedoms as well. Okay, folks, hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X @ForBoxDiner. Don't forget to subscribe to both Rumble and to YouTube, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.